Jake Morrison stepped off the transport shuttle and looked up at the massive buildings of the Galactic Learning Institute. The structures seemed to grow from the ground like giant mushrooms, their surfaces shimmering with colors he had never seen before. 3 suns hung in the alien sky, casting strange shadows that moved in ways that hurt his eyes if he stared too long. He adjusted the heavy pack on his shoulders and walked toward the main entrance. Other students moved around him, but they were not like any students he had ever seen. A group of tall, thin beings with blue scales glided past, their movements so smooth they seemed to float. Their large eyes watched him with obvious fear before they quickly looked away. Near the entrance, creatures made of what looked like living crystals stood in a tight circle. Light passed through their bodies, creating rainbow patterns on the ground. When Jake walked by, they made high-pitched sounds that might have been their way of talking. The sounds grew faster and more urgent as he passed. A security guard at the entrance looked like a walking tree. Its bark-covered face turned toward Jake, and small glowing fruits hanging from its branches pulsed with yellow light. "Name and species," it said in a voice like wind through leaves. "Jake Morrison, human," he replied, showing his identification pad. The tree being's branches rustled. "Ah yes, the Deathworlder exchange student. You must report to medical for your biodampener fitting before attending any classes." Jake frowned. Biodampener? Standard safety protocol for all predator species, the guard explained. It helps control aggressive impulses and makes other students feel safer around you. Jake wanted to argue, but he had been warned about this. Earth was classified as a Class 12 death world, and humans were considered barely civilized predators by most of the galaxy. He had come here to study xenobiology, to learn about alien life. Fighting the system on his first day would not help. The medical center was a clean white building that smelled like flowers and antiseptic. A floating jellyfish-like creature with glowing tentacles examined him with instruments that beeped and hummed. "Remarkable," it said in a voice like music. "Your stress hormones are completely normal. Most predator species show elevated aggression markers in new environments." "I am not aggressive," Jake said. "I am just curious about everything here." The jellyfish creature made a sound that might have been laughter. Curiosity in a predator species is often considered a form of hunting behavior. But your readings suggest genuine scientific interest rather than stalking patterns. The biodampener was a small metal disc that attached behind his ear. Jake could not feel any difference, but the jellyfish assured him it was working. "This will suppress your more dangerous instincts," it explained. "You will still be able to function normally, but other students will feel safer around you." Jake's dormitory room was in a section marked Special Accommodations. His neighbors were few and far between. Down the hall lived what looked like a giant spider with too many eyes. And across from him was a room marked Atmospheric Incompatible, with warning symbols he could not read. His first class was Introduction to Galactic Cultures. The classroom was huge, with different sections kept at different temperatures and atmospheric pressures for various species. Jake sat in the standard atmosphere section, which seemed to be designed for species that breathed oxygen like he did. Professor Knight entered the room, and Jake realized it was another tree being like the security guard, but much older. Its bark was darker, and its branches carried not just glowing fruits but also small creatures that might have been symbiotic partners. When it spoke, its voice carried the authority of centuries. "Welcome, students, to your introduction to the diverse cultures of our galaxy," Professor Knight began. "Today we have a very special addition to our class, a human from the planet Earth." Every eye, sensor, and optical organ in the room turned toward Jake. He felt his face grow warm, but tried to smile and wave. Several students in the front row immediately moved to seats farther away. "Humans," Professor Knight continued, "represent one of the newest species to achieve spaceflight and join galactic society. They come from what we classify as a Class 12 death world, where survival requires constant vigilance against numerous predatory threats." A student that looked like a cross between a deer and a butterfly raised a delicate hand. "Professor, is it safe to have a Deathworlder in class with us?" "An excellent question, Zara," Professor Knight replied. "Mr. Morrison has undergone all required safety protocols. His biodampener will prevent any predatory behavior, and his psychological evaluation showed remarkable self-control for his species." Jake felt like he was being discussed as if he were not there. "Excuse me," he said, raising his hand. "I would like to point out that humans are not mindless killers. We have art, music, literature, and philosophy. We have been peaceful for most of our recent history. The room fell silent. Several students made sounds that Jake guessed were expressions of surprise or fear. Professor Nith's branches rustled in what might have been approval. Indeed, humans are fascinating in that they appear to have overcome many of their predatory instincts through social evolution. However, genetic memory runs deep, and in stress situations, any species may revert to base behaviors. After class, Jake tried to approach some of his fellow students, but they scattered like leaves in the wind. Only two remained, the deer butterfly creature called Zara and a small crystal being that reflected light in beautiful patterns. I'm Zara of the Velthari, the deer butterfly, said in a voice like silver bells. I must admit you are not what I expected from a Deathworlder. What did you expect? Jake asked. Fangs, claws, visible weapons, she replied honestly. You look almost harmless. The crystal being made musical sounds and a small device around what Jake assumed was its neck translated. I am Kex of the Quartzling Collective. Your thought patterns are intriguing. Most prey species think in circles, seeking safety. Predator species think in straight lines, seeking targets. But your thoughts seem to spiral outward, seeking knowledge. Jake smiled. I guess that is what makes humans different. We hunt for understanding rather than food. Zara's large eyes blinked slowly. That is either the most beautiful thing I have ever heard or the most terrifying. Maybe both, Jake admitted. As they walked toward the dining area together, Jake noticed other students staring. Some whispered behind hands, claws, or tentacles. He caught fragments of conversations. Deathworlder, apex genetics, barely domesticated. The dining hall served food for dozens of different species. Jake found the human-compatible section and selected something that looked like pasta with vegetables. Zara chose what appeared to be flower petals and nectar, while Kex absorbed some kind of mineral solution. Tell me about Earth, Zara said as they ate. What is it really like to live on a death world? Jake thought about how to explain it. Imagine if every day you had to be aware that something might try to eat you, but you also had to be smart enough to find food, build shelter, and protect your family. Over millions of years, that made us good at solving problems quickly and working together. But the violence, Kex's translator said. The aggression. How do you control it? We choose to, Jake said simply. That is what civilization means to humans. We have the ability to be violent, but we choose to be peaceful. We have the instincts to fight, but we choose to cooperate. Zara tilted her head considering this. Choice, she repeated. Most species are governed by instinct. The idea that you can simply choose to be different is revolutionary. As Jake returned to his room that night, he reflected on his first day. He was clearly an outsider here, viewed with suspicion and fear, but perhaps that was exactly why he needed to be here. If humans were going to join galactic society, someone had to show that they could be trusted. Through his window, he could see the 3 alien suns setting, painting the sky in colors that had no names in any human language. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that humans belonged among the stars. But tonight, Jake Morrison, the first human exchange student at the Galactic Learning Institute, fell asleep to the sound of alien wind through impossible architecture, dreaming of the day when the word Deathworlder would be spoken with respect rather than fear. 3 weeks had passed since Jake's arrival at the Galactic Learning Institute, and he had settled into a routine that felt almost normal. Almost every morning, he would wake to the sound of crystalline chimes that served as the universal alarm system, eat breakfast in the mostly empty human-compatible section of the dining hall, and walk to classes while other students gave him a wide circle of space. His friendship with Zara and Kex had grown stronger, though it remained unusual by galactic standards. Prey species rarely formed close bonds with predators, and most of their classmates watched their interactions with fascination and horror. It is like watching someone pet a sleeping dragon, Jake had overheard one student say to another. The comment stung, but he was beginning to understand that changing thousands of years of evolutionary programming would take time. Professor Nith's xenobiology class had become Jake's favorite. Today's lesson focused on extinct megafauna from various worlds, and Jake found himself genuinely excited to learn about creatures that had once ruled alien landscapes. Today we will examine the apex predators that once dominated the now peaceful world of Serenity Prime. Professor Nith announced, its branches rustling with what Jake had learned was the equivalent of clearing its throat. The Shadow Stalkers were magnificent creatures. standing 3 meters tall with retractable blade claws and the ability to phase partially out of visible light. A hologram appeared in the center of the classroom, showing a creature that looked like a cross between a tiger and a nightmare. Several students made distressed sounds, and one Velthari actually fainted, its delicate frame crumpling to the floor. "Fascinating," Jake said, leaning forward to get a better look. "The bone structure suggests they were ambush predators rather than pursuit hunters. Those claws would be perfect for a quick, decisive strike." The classroom fell silent except for the soft whimpering of several students. Jake looked around, confused by their reactions. "Mr. Morrison," Professor Neth said carefully, "perhaps you could explain your analysis?" "Well, look at the muscle attachment points on the hind legs," Jake said, standing and pointing at the hologram. "They are built for explosive power, not endurance. And the eye placement gives them excellent depth perception for judging distances. These creatures would hide, wait for prey to come close, then strike once with maximum force." "How can you tell all that just by looking?" Zara whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "Basic anatomy," Jake replied. "On Earth, we study predator behavior as part of understanding our own evolutionary history. Humans evolved alongside creatures like this." A student that resembled a walking flower suddenly stood up and ran from the classroom, leaving behind a trail of sweet-smelling pollen that Jake's enhanced human senses told him was a fear response. "Mr. Morrison," Professor Nith said, its voice taking on a more formal tone, "perhaps you could share with the class what other predators humans evolved alongside." Jake did not notice the warning in the professor's voice. He was too excited to share knowledge about Earth's incredible biological diversity. "Oh, there were so many. Saber-toothed cats with fangs longer than my forearm, cave bears that stood 4 meters tall, dire wolves that hunted in packs of 50 or more, and those were just the mammals. We also had giant crocodiles, massive eagles that could carry off adult humans, and during earlier periods, creatures like Tyrannosaurus rex." With each creature Jake described, more students showed signs of distress. Several quartzlings shattered into defensive fragments, their crystalline bodies spreading across the floor like broken glass but still somehow alive. The remaining Velthari huddled together, their normally graceful movements reduced to trembling. "But the really interesting thing," Jake continued, oblivious to the panic he was causing, "is that humans did not just survive alongside these predators. We competed with them. We hunted the same prey, and sometimes we hunted each other. That is why humans developed our unique combination of intelligence, endurance, and pack cooperation." A sound like breaking wind chimes filled the air as more quartzlings shattered. One of the Aryans, the gas-form beings, dispersed so completely that Jake was not sure if it was still in the room or had effectively fled. "Mr. Morrison," Professor Nith said firmly, "I think that is enough for today." Jake finally noticed the state of his classmates. "Oh no, I am sorry. I did not mean to upset anyone. These creatures are all extinct. They cannot hurt you." "That is not the point," Zara said quietly, her voice barely audible. "You speak of them like they were old friends. You understand them. That means you are like them." The weight of her words hit Jake like a physical blow. He looked around the classroom at the scattered crystal fragments, the huddled prey species, the empty seats where students had fled. He had been trying to share his love of knowledge, but all they heard were the detailed observations of a predator analyzing other predators. "Class dismissed," Professor Neith announced. "Please remember that tomorrow we will be discussing the peaceful herbivores of the Andorian system. I trust that will be a less stimulating topic." As students filed out, giving Jake an even wider berth than usual, Zara and Kex remained behind. The crystal being had managed to pull itself back together, though its usual bright reflections seemed dimmed. "Jake," Zara said softly, "we need to talk." They found a quiet spot in the botanical gardens, where the alien plants provided some privacy. Jake sat on a bench designed for humanoid species while his friends positioned themselves nearby. "I heard the other students talking," Zara began. "Some of them are going to petition the administration to have you removed from advanced classes. They say you are too dangerous." "But I have never hurt anyone," Jake protested. "I wear the biodampener. I follow all the rules. It is not about what you do," Kex's translator said. "It is about what you are. When you described those predators, you sounded excited, happy. Prey species do not feel happy when thinking about things that could kill them." Jake rubbed his face with his hands. "I was excited about the knowledge, not the killing. Humans study predators to understand nature, not because we want to be like them." But you are like them, Zara said gently. That is what we are finally beginning to understand. When you look at a shadow stalker, you do not see a monster. You see a solution to a survival problem. You see efficiency, effectiveness, evolutionary success. Is that wrong? Jake asked. Not wrong, Kex replied, but terrifying to species who see the same creature and think only of death. They sat in silence for a while, watching alien butterflies with metallic wings dance among flowers that sang in harmonious chords. There is something else, Zara said eventually. Professor Nith announced that next week we will be visiting the biocontainment facility for our first practical examination of living predator specimens. Jake perked up. That sounds fascinating. That is exactly what we are afraid of, Zara said. What happens when you come face to face with actual living predators? What happens when all your evolutionary instincts activate at once? Nothing will happen, Jake said confidently. I am civilized. I have self-control. But even as he said it, Jake felt a small doubt creep into his mind. He had never been tested in a real crisis situation since leaving Earth. The biodampener was supposed to suppress his more dangerous instincts. But what if it was not enough? What if, when faced with real predators, the millions of years of human evolution took over? I hope you are right, Zara said quietly. Because if you are wrong, it will not just be your education that ends. It will be any chance of humans being accepted into galactic society. That night, Jake lay in his bed staring at the alien constellations visible through his window. For the first time since arriving at the Institute, he wondered if he had made a mistake in coming here. Maybe humans really were too dangerous to mix with prey species. Maybe the galaxy was right to fear them. But then he thought about Zara and Kex, who had chosen to be his friends despite their instinctive fear. He thought about Professor Nith, who treated him with respect even while maintaining professional caution. Change was possible, but it would require more than just good intentions. It would require him to prove that humans could be trusted, even when faced with their own deepest nature. The practical examination was only a week away. Jake closed his eyes and tried to sleep, hoping that when the time came, he would be strong enough to choose civilization over instinct. But deep in his dreams, he could hear the distant roar of ancient predators calling to something primal in his blood. The morning of the biocontainment facility visit arrived with unusual weather. Dark clouds covered all three suns, and strange electrical storms crackled in the upper atmosphere. Jake noticed that many of his classmates seemed more nervous than usual, their various species-specific stress responses showing clearly. Professor Nith had assembled the xenobiology class outside the imposing structure of the biocontainment facility. The building looked like a fortress, with thick walls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Warning symbols in dozens of languages covered every surface, and the air hummed with the sound of multiple containment systems running at full power. Today you will observe living predator specimens from various worlds, Professor Nith announced, its ancient voice carrying over the nervous chatter of students. These creatures are kept here for scientific study and to help us understand the evolutionary pressures that shape predator behavior across the galaxy. Jake counted the students present. Several were missing, having chosen to skip the field trip entirely rather than face living predators. Of those who remained, most stayed clustered together in tight groups, finding comfort in numbers as their ancestors had for millions of years. Zara stood close to Jake, though he noticed she kept glancing at the exits as if memorizing escape routes. Kex had positioned itself near a group of other crystalline beings, ready to shatter into defensive fragments if necessary. The facility maintains the highest safety standards in the galaxy, Professor Nith continued. Each specimen is contained in an escape-proof enclosure with multiple backup systems. Observation will be conducted through reinforced bioglass that can withstand the strongest attacks. A security guard that looked like a mobile plant with thorny vines for arms led them through the entrance. Jake had to pass through 3 separate scanners that checked for weapons, diseases, and what the readout called aggressive intent. Markers. His biodampener registered, green on all systems. The first viewing chamber contained what the information panel labeled shadow cats from Umbral Prime. The creatures moved like liquid darkness, their forms shifting and flowing in ways that hurt to watch directly. They were beautiful in a terrible way, perfect killing machines adapted for a world where darkness was absolute. Jake found himself fascinated by their movement patterns. He pressed close to the bioglass, studying how they coordinated their pack behavior through subtle body language. "Incredible," he murmured. "Look how they communicate through posture alone. No sounds, no visible signals, just pure physical coordination." Around him, his classmates had the opposite reaction. The Velthari students had frozen in place, their flight response completely triggered by the sight of active predators. Several quartzlings had begun to vibrate, creating a high-pitched whine that spoke of deep distress. "Mr. Morrison," Professor Nith said carefully, "perhaps you could step back from the viewing window?" Jake reluctantly moved away, not understanding why his scientific interest was causing such concern. He joined the group as they moved to the next viewing chamber. The second enclosure held crystal hunters from the Andorian system. These creatures looked like living gemstones, beautiful and deadly, with the ability to refract light into cutting beams. They moved in perfect geometric patterns, their crystalline bodies creating hypnotic displays of color and light. Again, Jake found himself drawn to study their behavior. The way they position themselves suggests they hunt by creating light patterns that confuse their prey, he observed. It is like biological camouflage, but in reverse. This time, several students actually backed away from Jake as well as the creatures. He was beginning to realize that his analytical approach to predator behavior was as frightening to them as the predators themselves. The final viewing chamber was the largest, containing what the information panel called a void stalker juvenile specimen. Jake read the details with growing excitement. The creature was from a world where gravity was 3 times Earth normal, and it had evolved to hunt in complete darkness using echolocation and electromagnetic senses. The void stalker itself was magnificent. It looked like a cross between a panther and something from humanity's deepest nightmares, with sleek black fur that seemed to absorb light and eyes that glowed with an inner fire. It was roughly the size of a large dog, though the information panel noted that adults could grow to the size of Earth's ancient cave bears. This specimen is considered moderately dangerous by galactic standards, Professor Neth explained. It is classified as a Class 5 predator, suitable for educational observation but requiring extreme containment protocols. Jake studied the creature's enclosure. Multiple force fields shimmered around the physical barriers, and he could see energy readings that indicated several backup containment systems running simultaneously. As the class gathered around the viewing window, Jake noticed something odd. The facility's lights flickered briefly, and a low humming sound that had been constant since their arrival suddenly changed pitch. "That is strange," he said. But before he could elaborate, Professor Nath was explaining the creature's hunting patterns. "The Void Stalker is a perfect example of adaptation to extreme environments," the professor said. "Its home world has no visible light, so it has developed alternative senses that make it a supremely effective hunter." As if responding to the description, the creature turned toward the viewing window. Its glowing eyes seemed to focus directly on Jake, and for a moment he felt an odd sensation, as if something was studying him with the same intensity that he was studying it. The lights flickered again, more severely this time. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting strange shadows throughout the chamber. Professor Nith's branches rustled with what Jake had learned was concern. "That should not be happening," the security guard said, checking a handheld device. "All systems show green." Then, without warning, every light in the facility went out. Emergency power kicked in immediately, bathing everything in red light. Alarm sounds filled the air, but these were not the gentle chimes used elsewhere in the Institute. These were harsh, urgent warnings that spoke of real danger. "Remain calm," Professor Nith commanded, but Jake could hear the strain in the ancient being's voice. "Emergency protocols are in effect. Security will escort us out momentarily." Through the red emergency lighting, Jake saw movement in the Void Stalker's enclosure. The creature was pacing now, agitated by the sudden change in its environment. The multiple force fields that contained it were flickering like candles in the wind. "Professor," Jake said urgently, "something is wrong with the containment systems." Before Professor Nith could respond, a sound like breaking glass filled the air, but it was not glass breaking. It was the sound of multiple force fields failing simultaneously. The Void Stalker stood perfectly still for a moment, as if it could not believe its good fortune. Then, with fluid grace that spoke of millions of years of evolutionary perfection, it leaped through the gap where its containment had been. Chaos erupted in the viewing chamber. The Velthari students froze completely. their bodies locking into the absolute stillness that was their species' ultimate defense mechanism. The quartzlings exploded into thousands of fragments, scattering across the floor in a desperate attempt to present no single target. The few Aryans in the group dispersed into barely visible wisps of gas. Professor Neath activated an emergency beacon, calling for security, but the nearest response team was still minutes away. The Void Stalker emerged into the viewing chamber, its electromagnetic senses immediately cataloging every living being present. Jake felt time slow down around him. His biodampener was still functioning, but in the face of immediate danger, millions of years of human evolution were asserting themselves. His vision became sharper, his hearing more acute, and his mind began calculating distances, threats, and escape routes with the cold efficiency of an apex predator. The Void Stalker's glowing eyes swept the room, cataloging targets. It was confused and frightened by the alien environment, but it was still a predator, and predators responded to fear with aggression. Its gaze settled on Zara, who stood frozen in the middle of the chamber, her flight response so completely triggered that she could not move at all. To the Void Stalker's senses, she was the most obvious target, alone, vulnerable, and radiating fear like a beacon. The creature's muscles tensed as it prepared to leap. Jake felt something deep inside him wake up, something that the biodampener could not suppress because it was not aggression or violence. It was the same instinct that had made early humans throw themselves between saber-toothed cats and their children, the same drive that had led his species to hunt mammoths and build civilizations. It was the need to protect. Without conscious thought, Jake stepped between the Void Stalker and Zara. He did not run, did not call for help, did not try to hide behind the bioglass like every instinct his classmates possessed would have demanded. Instead, Jake Morrison, human, descendant of persistence hunters and pack leaders, stood his ground and looked a Class 5 predator directly in the eyes. The Void Stalker stopped, its leap frozen in mid-preparation. In its electromagnetic senses, Jake was no longer reading as prey. He was reading as something else entirely. He was reading as another predator. Time seemed frozen in the red emergency lighting of the biocontainment facility. Jake stood perfectly still, his eyes locked with those of the Void Stalker, while behind him his classmates remained trapped in their various fear responses. The only sounds were the distant wail of alarms and the creature's soft breathing. Jake's mind was working faster than it ever had before. Every detail of the situation burned itself into his consciousness with crystal clarity. The creature's posture, the way its muscles were tensed, the slight tilt of its head as it tried to understand what it was facing. His biodampener was still functioning, but it could not suppress what was happening to him now. Because this was not aggression or violence, this was something purely human. The Void Stalker was roughly 2 meters away, close enough that Jake could smell its alien scent, something like ozone and copper. Its electromagnetic senses were reading him constantly, trying to categorize him as predator or prey. Jake knew instinctively that any sudden movement, any sign of fear would trigger an attack. So he did what millions of years of human evolution had programmed him to do when faced with a dangerous predator. He made himself appear larger. Slowly, carefully, Jake raised his arms away from his body, not in a threatening gesture, but in a way that increased his visible size and made him look more formidable. The movement was deliberate, controlled, showing the creature that he was not afraid. The Void Stalker's glowing eyes tracked the movement, its head tilting further as it processed this unexpected behavior. Prey animals made themselves smaller when threatened, trying to avoid notice. Only other predators made themselves larger, claiming territory and showing dominance. "Easy," Jake said softly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. He was not talking to the creature. It could not understand human language, but speaking helped him maintain his own calm. "I see you. You see me? Neither of us wants this fight." Behind him he could hear Professor Nith making urgent calls on its emergency communicator, but the words seemed to come from very far away. Jake's entire focus was on the deadly creature in front of him. The Void Stalker took a step forward, testing, and Jake did something that made several of his classmates make sounds of pure terror. He took a step forward as well. It was a calculated risk based on what he knew about predator psychology. Running would trigger a chase response, Standing still would eventually be interpreted as submission. But matching the creature's movement, showing that he was not intimidated, might make it reconsider its options. The creature stopped, clearly confused. Its electromagnetic senses were telling it that this strange being was registering as another predator, but its appearance was all wrong. Jake was too small, too soft, too obviously vulnerable to be a real threat, yet he was acting like an apex predator, claiming space and showing no fear. Jake began to back away slowly, one careful step at a time. This was the most dangerous part. He needed to create distance between the creature and his classmates without triggering a pursuit response. Every movement had to communicate confidence without aggression, retreat without submission. The Voidstalker followed, matching his pace exactly. Good. Jake was leading it away from the clustered students toward the far side of the chamber. If he could keep its attention focused on him, security would have a clear shot when they arrived. That's right, Jake murmured, continuing his slow backward movement. Follow me. I'm the interesting one here. I'm the challenge. Step by step they moved across the chamber in a deadly dance. The creature's posture remained aggressive but uncertain. In its natural environment, this standoff would eventually be resolved by one predator backing down and leaving the other's territory. But this was not the creature's territory, and Jake was not backing down. When Jake's back touched the wall, he knew the dance was about to change. The creature was now 6 meters away from the other students, but Jake had run out of room to retreat. The Voidstalker seemed to sense this change, its muscles tensing as it prepared for what it thought would be the final confrontation. That was when Jake did something that no prey species would ever have thought of, something that was purely and uniquely human. He used a tool. The bioscanner that Professor Nith had been using to read information about the creatures was sitting on a nearby table. Without breaking eye contact with the Voidstalker, Jake reached slowly to his side and picked it up. The creature's eyes tracked the movement, but it did not attack. Jake was still projecting confidence, still maintaining the standoff, so the creature waited to see what this strange predator would do next. Jake remembered reading about the Voidstalker's enhanced electromagnetic senses. The scanner in his hand was designed to read biological data, which meant it produced electromagnetic signals. If he could overload those sensitive organs. With a quick motion, Jake activated the scanner and turned its output to maximum. The device began emitting a high-frequency electromagnetic pulse designed to penetrate biological tissue for deep scanning. The effect on the Voidstalker was immediate. The creature's electromagnetic senses were suddenly flooded with noise, like a human being hit with a spotlight in complete darkness. It stumbled backward, shaking its head and making a sound like electronic feedback. Jake did not wait to see if the distraction would last. "Security!" he shouted, finally breaking the silence that had held the chamber. Now would be good. The chamber doors burst open as the security team arrived, armed with containment weapons designed specifically for escaped specimens. The lead guard, a heavily armored being that looked like a walking tank, immediately assessed the situation. "Containment breach, Class 5 specimen," it announced. All students moved to emergency positions. The Voidstalker, still disoriented by the electromagnetic pulse, found itself suddenly surrounded by beings with proper containment equipment. Without the advantage of surprise or confined prey, it quickly calculated that the odds were no longer in its favor. When the containment team fired their capture nets, the creature did not resist. It allowed itself to be secured and led back to a backup containment chamber. Though its glowing eyes remained fixed on Jake until it disappeared from view, the chamber fell silent except for the gradually quieting alarms. Emergency lighting gave way to normal illumination as the facility's systems came back online. Jake stood against the wall, still holding the bioscanner, suddenly aware that his hands were shaking. "Jake!" Zara's voice broke through his post-adrenaline haze. She was moving toward him, her normal, graceful glide replaced by an unsteady rush. "Are you hurt? Are you damaged? I cannot believe you. Why did you—" She stopped just out of arm's reach, her large eyes wide with an expression Jake had never seen before. It was not fear, exactly, but something deeper and more complex. Professor Nith approached more slowly, its ancient branches rustling with what Jake was beginning to recognize as deep contemplation. "Mr. Morrison," it said formally, That was either the most foolish or the most courageous thing I have witnessed in 3 centuries of teaching. I could not let it hurt Zara, Jake said simply, or any of the others. That is what humans do. We protect our pack. Pack? Kex's translator spoke up. The crystalline being had managed to reform itself and was now reflecting light in patterns Jake had learned, indicated intense thought. You consider us your pack? Jake looked around the chamber at his classmates who were slowly emerging from their fear responses. They were all staring at him with expressions he had never seen before. Not fear, not suspicion, but something like awe. Of course, he said. We are classmates. We study together, eat together, learn together. In human terms, that makes you family. The word seemed to hang in the air like a physical thing. Professor Nith's fruits pulsed with rapid flashes of light, and Jake could hear whispered conversations in a dozen alien languages as his classmates processed what they had just witnessed. A human had faced down a Class 5 predator, not for territory, not for food, not for dominance, but to protect creatures that were not even his own species. The security review will be extensive, Professor Nith said eventually. There will be questions about your actions, investigations into the containment failure, and formal inquiries into the safety protocols. Jake nodded, expecting as much. Am I in trouble? Professor Nith's branches rustled, and what Jake had learned was the tree being's equivalent of gentle laughter. Mr. Morrison, you may have just changed the course of human-alien relations forever. Whether that counts as trouble or triumph remains to be seen. As they filed out of the facility, Jake noticed that his classmates were no longer giving him a wide berth. If anything, they seemed to want to stay close to him, as if his presence represented safety rather than danger. Zara walked beside him, occasionally glancing up at his face as if seeing him for the first time. I need to understand something, she said quietly. When you faced that creature, you were not afraid. Why? Jake thought about it as they walked through the alien afternoon, with 3 suns painting strange shadows on the ground. I was terrified, he admitted. But fear and courage are not opposites. Courage is what you do when you are afraid but choose to act anyway. Is that what makes humans different? She asked. The choice? Jake smiled, remembering a conversation from his first day. Maybe that. The formal inquiry took place 3 days after the biocontainment incident, in the Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Learning Institute. Jake sat at a simple table in the center of the circular chamber, surrounded by representatives from a dozen different species, all there to determine whether the first human exchange student was too dangerous to remain at the institute. The chamber itself was impressive, with floating platforms arranged in concentric circles around the central speaking area. Each platform was customized for different species' needs. Some filled with water for aquatic beings, others kept at specific atmospheric pressures, and a few that simply contained swirling energy patterns for the more exotic life forms. Dean Coral Singer, a being that looked like a living reef with thousands of tiny glowing polyps, served as the head of the inquiry board. Its voice emerged from somewhere within its coral structure, sounding like gentle waves against a shore. This inquiry has been called to determine whether human student Jake Morrison poses a threat to the safety of other students at this institution, Dean Coral Singer announced. We will hear testimony from witnesses, review security recordings, and examine the implications of the events that occurred in Biocontainment Laboratory 7. Jake had spent the past 3 days in a strange kind of limbo. He was not restricted to his room, but security escorts followed him everywhere. Some students avoided him more than ever, while others seemed fascinated by what they had heard about the incident. The strangest part was that several prey species had actually approached him, asking quietly if the rumors were true. Had he really faced down a Class 5 predator to protect other students? Professor Nith was the first witness called. The ancient tree being positioned itself on a platform designed for plant-based life forms, its roots extending into specially prepared soil. In my 3 centuries of teaching, Professor Nith began, I have observed many species in crisis situations. Prey species typically respond with flight, freezing, or hiding behaviors. Predator species usually respond with aggression or territorial displays. Human student Morrison's response was unique in my experience. Please elaborate, requested board member Zephyr Dance, an Aryan whose gaseous form swirled in complex patterns. The human positioned himself between the escaped predator and potential victims. then engaged in what I can only describe as a dominance display, designed to protect others rather than claim territory for himself. This combination of predatory capability with protective instinct is unprecedented in our records. Jake listened as Professor Nith described the incident in clinical terms, but he could see the deeper impact of the event in the reactions of the board members. Species that had never interacted with humans before were hearing about behavior that challenged their basic understanding of predator psychology. The security footage was played next, and Jake watched himself from multiple angles as he faced down the Void Stalker. Seeing it from the outside, he understood why his classmates had been so shocked. His movements had been fluid and confident, projecting an authority that seemed impossible for someone his size facing a creature bred for killing. The human subject shows no signs of fear paralysis, noted Dr. Mindweb, a spider-like being whose 8 eyes tracked different aspects of the recording simultaneously. His biodampener readings remained stable throughout the encounter, indicating that his actions were conscious choices rather than instinctive responses. When it was time for student testimony, Zara was the first to speak. She positioned herself on a platform designed for Velthari physiology, her blue scales shimmering with nervousness. "Jake Morrison saved my life," she said simply. "When the Void Stalker escaped, I could not move. My fear response was complete. If Jake had not intervened, I would have been killed. Do you believe the human student poses a danger to you or other students?" Dean Coralsinger asked. Zara was quiet for a long moment, her large eyes fixed on Jake. "I believe Jake Morrison is the safest being at this institute," she said finally. "Not because he lacks the ability to be dangerous, but because he chooses not to be. That choice makes him more trustworthy than species who are harmless simply because they lack the capacity for harm." Kex testified next. Its crystalline form refracting light in patterns that Jake had learned indicated deep thought. "Human Morrison's actions have forced me to recalculate my understanding of predator behavior," Kex said through its translator. "His willingness to risk himself for others suggests that humans have evolved beyond simple predator-prey dynamics into something more complex." More students testified, and a pattern emerged. Those who had been in the biocontainment facility spoke of Jake with something approaching reverence. He had become, in their minds, not a predator to be feared, but a guardian to be trusted. Finally, Jake was called to speak for himself. He stood at the central podium, looking up at the circle of alien faces and sensing organs pointed in his direction. "I know that humans are different from most species in galactic society," he began. "We come from a world where danger was constant, where survival required us to be strong and quick and willing to fight. But that same world also taught us that the strongest individuals are not those who dominate others, but those who protect them." He paused, searching for the right words to explain something that seemed obvious to him, but revolutionary to others. "On Earth, we have a saying, with great power comes great responsibility. Humans learned long ago that our ability to be dangerous means we have a duty to be careful. Our capacity for violence means we must choose peace. Our potential to be predators means we must choose to be protectors." Board member Crystal Harmony, a being of living gemstone similar to Kex but ancient beyond measure, spoke up. "You are asking us to trust that an entire species of predators will consistently choose restraint over aggression. History suggests this is unlikely." Jake nodded. "You are right to be cautious. But consider this. Humans have had weapons capable of destroying our entire planet for over a century. We have had the power to eliminate all life on Earth, and yet we choose not to use it. Every day, millions of humans choose cooperation over competition, protection over predation. What makes you different from other predator species?" asked Dean Coralsinger. "We evolved in groups," Jake replied. "Humans are pack hunters, but we are also pack protectors. Our strength comes not from individual dominance, but from collective cooperation. When one human is threatened, all humans in the pack respond. But when a human pack adopts non-humans as members, those protections extend to them as well." The inquiry board deliberated for hours while Jake waited in an adjoining chamber. Zara and Kex stayed with him, along with several other students who had become his friends over the past weeks. "Whatever they decide, you did the right thing," Zara told him. "You showed us what humans really are." "What are we?" Jake asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "Evolution's attempt to create the perfect guardian," she replied. "Strong enough to face any threat, smart enough to choose when not to fight, and loyal enough to risk everything for those you care about. When the board reconvened, Dean Coral Singer's announcement surprised everyone. The inquiry board has reached a unanimous decision. Human student Jake Morrison will not only remain at the Galactic Learning Institute, but his case will be used to develop new protocols for integrating protective predator species into galactic society. The chamber erupted in sounds that Jake was learning to recognize as expressions of approval from various species. Furthermore, Dean Coral Singer continued, "We are recommending that the Galactic Council reconsider the classification of humans as a potentially dangerous species. The evidence suggests that humans represent something new in our understanding of evolutionary psychology." Professor Neith requested permission to speak. "I would like to propose that human student Morrison be invited to present a series of lectures on human psychology and behavior. If humans are to join galactic society, we must understand them better." The proposal was approved immediately. Later that evening, Jake found himself in the Institute's observation deck, looking up at the alien constellations. He was joined by a growing number of friends, not just Zara and Kex, but students from species he had never expected to accept him. "I've been thinking about what you said during the inquiry," Zara said, settling beside him with her characteristic grace, "about humans adopting non-humans into their packs." "What about it?" Jake asked. "Do you really consider us pack members?" Jake looked around at the gathered students, beings of crystal and gas and scales and bark, all so different from himself but all choosing to be here with him. "I consider you family," he said simply. The words seemed to create a moment of perfect silence among the diverse group. "Then we need to understand something," Keck said through its translator. "If we are your pack and you are our guardian, what does that make us to each other?" Jake smiled, thinking of a concept that might be truly alien to species that had never needed to band together for survival. "It makes us something new," he said. "We are not predator and prey anymore. We are not human and alien. We are just us." A month later, Jake stood before a packed auditorium giving his first official lecture on human psychology. The title of his talk was Predators,